My name is Gwen Olson, and I am the author of Confessions of an RX Drug Pusher, God's Call to Loving Arms. And I wrote my book in August of 2005. I spent 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry working as a detail rep, primarily as a specialist rep calling on psychiatry, cardiology, neurology, endocrinology, and OBGYN. And after 15 years in the industry, I felt like I had a moral obligation to come out and tell people what I had experienced, what I had seen, and what I had participated in the industry, because there were a number of things that I had identified and recognized as being dangerous to the American people at large. And one of those things was the consistent minimization of side effects that drug reps were taught to do. And I was very concerned about the fact that it was seemingly less and less popular to give full disclosure about our drugs as time went on in my profession. And we were more responsible for marketing information being given to the doctors than actual good medical information, fair, balanced medical information. And we were given the exact verbiage, the taglines that went along with the marketing department's plan for that particular sales period, and those were specifically the things that we were supposed to say. And often these things had been cleared through legal so that we weren't saying things that were illegal, but the semantics of them might have been implying things to be a little bit differently than they were. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the biggest things that I saw that took place was when we would get marketing promotional materials. For example, a sales piece would come out and have a bar chart or information from a clinical study on it that raised concern with the physicians. Say a number of physicians would start to complain about the excessive number of CNS side effects, for example. Then what we would see is the next marketing period, after reps had disclosed that during a district meeting or some kind of a pool meeting that we had, that marketing piece would come out and would be revised, and that bar chart would be changed, or that specific information would be altered so that perhaps the CNS side effects were now broken out to dizziness and, the various other side effects that would be included in the central nervous system section. So it didn't show quite so drastically how severe the side effects were. So what I started to realize is that statistics were actually the semantics of research, and that you could take statistics and bar charts and pretty much manipulate them and make them look pretty much however you wanted them to. And that began to concern me, as well as the fact that I wasn't being encouraged after a period of time to have full disclosure with my doctors. In fact, we were starting to be encouraged to minimize more and more and to skillfully sidestep the concerns and objections of physicians. And I knew that that created a dangerous environment for the patient. And I saw firsthand several circumstances where my minimization of side effects or misinforming a physician had actually resulted in the patient being damaged and or killed. And so I decided that there was something very, very wrong with the way that drugs were being approved and marketed, and the FDA was no longer serving the position for the people that they were supposed to serve, to protect our interests and to make sure that dangerous drugs were not being released onto the marketplace. And in fact, they became the buds of the pharmaceutical industry. I heard on more than one occasion people refer to our friends in the FDA or our people in the FDA, when in fact, prior to that period of time, the FDA in no way, shape, or form had friends of ours in the pharmaceutical industry. So that was really a red flag for me, that things were going downhill rapidly in American medicine, and I didn't want to be a part of it any longer. Initially, during my tenure in the pharmaceutical industry, I sold psychiatric drugs in the mental institutions, the MHMR clinics, psychiatric emergency rooms of hospitals. And while I was selling psychiatric drugs, I really got an education about the fact that many of the manifestations that I had seen in terms of behavioral things, such as pill rolling and the shuffling gait and the jaw and lip smacking that you often would see patients in mental institutions exhibiting, that these were not manifestations of their psychiatric illnesses. These were actually manifestations of their psychiatric drugs. And then I started to realize that there was something called the revolving door syndrome. This is what I was educated on by McNeil Pharmaceutical, actually, when I sold Haldol, that there's something known as the revolving door syndrome. And what that means is that patients who are hospitalized continue to come back repeatedly. And every time they come back, they have lost more function than the previous time that they were admitted. So I started to put one and one together and started to look at the side effects that people were exhibiting from these drugs and realized that these were actually brain-damaging therapeutics, and that we weren't talking about this aspect of the drug with the doctor. We weren't talking about this aspect of these drugs with the general population. Who was discussing these things were the doctors in the mortality and morbidity conferences. When I was supposed to be the fly on the wall, standing there with the food that I was delivering for the doctors, I was also listening to the cases that they were talking about. And I started to realize that these were seriously brain-damaging therapeutics. The doctors would comment about it. The doctors were also, and their staffs were also often very concerned about patients who exhibited reactions to these drugs because they could in fact become violent and pose a threat to both the other patients and the staff. And so, knowing that these things weren't being disclosed to people in the general public, I started to wonder what the motivation was behind keeping this information from people. Why would they not let people know the full disclosure about the drugs? Because I knew that if someone was actually crazy and they got relief from a drug, it only made common sense that they would want to take the drug and that they would feel normal again and they would be stabilized. And in fact, it was proven by, the various experiences that I had that the reason that people didn't want to take their drugs was because they were in fact not getting relief. They were getting more severe symptoms and having more exacerbation of mental illness when they were on the drugs than they were when they were off the drugs. So I started to question. There were a group of people that were out rallying one time in front of one of the buildings that we were approaching, and my district manager says, "Oh, that's just a bunch of Scientologists. They're, all those crazy people. They belong to a cult. They're all anti-psychiatric drugs. In fact, anytime anybody isn't for psychiatric drugs, if you just label them a Scientologist, that'll discredit them because everybody knows they're crazy." So that kind of became my, little tagline for anybody that spoke out against psychiatric drugs, because I knew then that you could label them as a Scientologist and people didn't know anything about Scientology, but they'd already gotten a bad rap because the pharmaceutical industry was promoting that they were a cult that was basically just out to destroy the psychiatric industry. Another aspect of the pharmaceutical sales reps training that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is how professional that they are trained as sales reps. In fact, I was trained when I worked for Bristol Myers Squibb how to profile physicians based on their personality types so that you would know how to be most influential with a doctor and how to get them to prescribe your drugs. And that was like you would profile a doctor as either being an analytical or they were a driver. But that specifically was the way that we were supposed to approach the doctor. If you knew if he was an analytical, then you were supposed to approach him with a research study because they were people that liked numbers and people that wanted, that type of information. And if they were an amiable, then you knew that that was the kind of person that you could basically just get to do anything that you wanted them to do because they were just people pleasers and they wanted to make you happy. And so you could pretty much lean on those people as opinion leaders if you wanted them to promote drugs off-label for you with other practices or with other physicians. And then, of course, there were the drivers, which were the doctors who were in charge, and therefore you had to take the back seat, let them think that they were leading the conversation and that you weren't teaching them anything. You were, in fact, just talking to them. And that type of training was very intricate. I mean, we were taught specifically how to approach physicians so that we could get the maximum result out of our presentations.